Thank you to the Pennsylvania Soybean Board for sponsoring our 2025 Crops Conference and Crops Days events. The Pennsylvania Soybean Board is responsible for the proper allocation of soybean checkoff dollars. This farmer-led board preserves and advances animal agriculture, identifies and promotes sustainable practices that provide ROI to farmers, promote biofuels through partnering opportunities, and drive new initiatives to increase the value and understanding of soy. Check them out online at pasoybean.org. Sponsors like the Pennsylvania Soybean Board allow us to host the annual Crops Conference and Crops Days events across the state. These events recap the 2024 PA crop production season, give insight to the latest agronomic research, products, and technology, and offer attendees pesticide recertification credits. If you would like to learn more about these events or to register, visit extension.psu.edu/crops-2025.
Welcome to another episode of the Agronomy Highlights podcast. I'm your host, Ryan Spelman, and I'm joined here, as always, with my lovely co-host, Justin Brackenrich. Justin, how are you doing today?
I'm doing good, Ryan. How about yourself?
Well, Justin, I am always living the dream, and we're starting to think about our spring, as far off as that may seem now. Today, we're going to be talking about assessing our spring forage and our spring small grain stands and kind of where we take that information and run with it. So we're about a month and a half to 2 months out, depending on where you are in the state, from doing this. So it's a good time to kind of prepare for that and think about what we should be looking for and what kind of management decisions we need to make based on those early season assessments. So Justin, I don't know, could you maybe talk a little bit about when you're doing these early spring assessments, what you're looking at and what you know about this?
Sure. Yeah. So I think maybe I'll diverge a little bit, but I think specifically the interest that I'm hearing or seeing this year is coming back from where I'm at in the western part of the state and our drought and the effect that that had last year. Folks are really interested in, we'll say maybe concerned in what that drought did to their forages last year during the summer, what they were like when they went to bed in the wintertime last year, how this cold and rain and snow has affected them through the spring or late winter and in the spring, and what they're going to look like coming out of that, right? So I've maybe been seeing and hearing more buzz around the forage side of it than usual. What do you think we should be doing? Have we totally lost them? What are we going to do? And so I will say I probably know more today than I have over the last few years just because it's forced me to know a little bit more about it. I don't do a lot with small grains where I'm at, right? Wheat's not a primary crop. We do a little bit of rye cover. But typically what we're looking at is tillering. And I think one of these episodes where we're going to talk with Zach Curtis, tillering is not always as simple as it sounds to just go out and count tillers, right? There's a little bit of a process to primary and axillary versus last year's stems versus new stems. And so it can be a little bit confusing and not to be too punny to get down in the weeds on some of this stuff. But it's always great to talk to experts and get their opinions on where we should start, when we should start, and how we should do it.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, I probably have a little bit more, get more calls and looking at, small grains. In my area, I have a lot of wheat producers. However, in my background, I'm often assessing based on, am I seeing diseases, nutrient deficiencies? And to be honest, I haven't spent a lot of time really digging into understanding what a good stand looks like, from an agronomic perspective. I know that's probably a bad thing to say as an agronomist. I'm being a very bad agronomist here. This is really foundational, right? To understanding how your small grain will do or your forage early on based on these densities. But usually I'm looking at this from the perspective of, do I see discoloration in the new growth that would indicate a nutrient deficiency versus a disease? Am I seeing, the soil conditions that are wet that kind of tells me that if you're having some patchiness, there's probably a disease under there, root rot. So that's usually what I'm thinking about when I'm thinking about early season stand assessments. So it's going to be really great to hear from some of our agronomists here that have a more of a agronomic focus in their assessments of their stand and what they're looking for when they're trying to make those early season decisions based on that assessment. So
I think a big challenge, or maybe challenge isn't the right word, but a big thing that happens with small grains, or at least where I'm at. I'm sure as you move to the east, it's maybe a little different. But often with us in small grains, they're I'm trying to find the right words to use, but they're part of a rotation, not necessarily considered like a headliner as a cash crop, right? The money makers are the corn and the soy, but this, whether it's wheat or whether it's rye or whatever is there, is often part of this rotation as a cover crop, as an incentivized, subsidized type thing that we've thrown in there that we're not necessarily looking at as like a big money maker, right? We're going to pay the bills off the others. This is just a little bit of icing on the cake for this year. And so it's kind of not often managed as well as we might like it to as agronomists. We're not often is keyed into that from the producer standpoint and taking stand counts in applying some of that fall fertilizer. Um, I know your pathology background, we're not often out there scouting for some of the disease that maybe we should be compared to our corn and beans. And so I think that as we start to look at maybe things getting a little tighter, and we've done some economic podcasts, and we're going to do another one on spring marketing and how things can change there. I think this is a really great opportunity this year for us to go out there, look at what we have in the field, and maybe say, this is the year that we're going to make this wheat a showstopper, or make this wheat something as part of our economic viability within our farm or our cover crop or whatever this is. And we're going to treat it like a crop rather than just this cover crop that's hanging out there scavenging things and stopping soil. Not that that's not excellent, but at the end of the day, we're money makers, and that's what we got to do.
yeah, and I think the same can be said. I could repeat exactly what you said and plug in forage, right? I think sometimes we forget in our perennial forage systems that's really really important to assess them early on in the season because they're also a money maker. I think we saw last year there were shortages of hay all over the place, and it became a really important thing to get as a high yield as you can, especially as we had a lot of drought issues, lagging of some fields. This is really becoming an important part of our rotation as well. Understanding, are we getting the most of our perennial systems, and that assessment starts early on. So I think this is a good time to
They
stop
didn't come
talking
to
and
hear
let our
us talk, did
experts.
they?
They did not come to hear us talk. So I appreciate you guys for sticking with us as we blabber in the beginning. Let's bring on the real experts. What do you say, Justin?
Let's do it.
All right. We have Dr. Daniela Carrijo and Dr. Guojie Wang, or we usually call him Dr. G, here today, and they're both specialists on our teams. Daniela has a background and a research in small grains and in all kinds of things in grain crops. So we'll let her kind of introduce what she does and what she knows about this topic. And Dr. G is our forage specialist. So yeah, we'll get started here. Why don't we just let Daniela introduce herself first, and then we'll move on to Dr. G.
Thanks, Ryan. Hi, everybody. So, yeah, I'm the grain crops extension specialist here at Penn State. I've been here for 3 years in this position now, and my team works on kind of all agronomic aspects of grain crops, mostly soybean and corn, but we do some work also on small grains, wheat, barley. We actually have a big project now starting with oats and hybrid rye as well that I'm excited for. Yeah, and I've got a little bit of background in small grains from my previous work at Oregon State, where I was at before here. And I'll say we're starting to work more in small grains here in my 4th year here. So, yeah, thanks for hosting.
Sure, thanks, Danielle. Yeah, I know Danielle has quite a diverse background in the work that she does. Just yesterday, we were presenting together at a crops day, and she did a talk on short corn varieties. So a lot of wealth of knowledge on variety trials and all kinds of crops. So, Dr. G, why don't you take a second to introduce yourself?
Well, thank you, Ryan. Hello to the audience. My name is Guojie Wang, very hard to remember. Call me G, so easier for everybody. I'm the forage extension specialist at Penn State. You can copy Daniela's sentences word to word, just replace everything from grain to forage. That's exactly me. So I cover forage species from perennial alfalfa orchard grass to annual sorghum and corn silage. So it's a very diverse crop group, and we care more now for the yield quality, also the environmental footprints to produce forage resources for our livestock and animal industries. I will stop here with other questions in detail later. Thank you.
Thanks, Dr. G and Daniela, for joining us. So before we get started, I want to take just a moment and kind of remind the listeners that what we're doing today is what we call our two-part episodes, right? And if you join us, you're familiar with when we do these. And sometimes it's because we have too much content. We just can't stop and help ourselves from just running over. But today it's because we've got kind of two similar topics that mesh together, and we want to release them at the same time so you can enjoy them both. The other part of this first part topic that we would like you to listen to, as well as this one, is where we're actually going to do the technical components of this stand assessment, right? What we're going to talk about with Daniela and G are, let's say we've gone out, we've got the stand assessment, we know the vigor and the plant life and all of the things. But with Zach Curtis, what we talk about is how do we get that number, right? How do we measure the plants per foot, or how do we actually visually assess where we are? And so for today's episode, I just want to make sure we understand these assumptions of we're going to make these statements of knowing what our tillers are, how many plants or how many tillers we have per square foot. We may mention things like viable or not viable or a need to terminate. Those are things that you're going to need to kind of get on your own through that other episode where we discuss that. So if you've already gone out and gotten your stand count, you're exactly where you need to be, right? Now is where we're going to start thinking, how do we remedy this and where do we move forward? So the first question I'm going to ask, this can be for Daniela or G, whoever wants to jump in there. When is the time that we should actually be making these stand counts? There's a lot of numbers, there's a few different metrics, but which one is the best time of year that we should be out scouting our forages or our small grains? Daniela, you look like you're ready to go. We'll start with you.
I'll go first here. Yeah, so the timing when I want to go out and scout and do those stand counts is really after plants start growing. So after those, if we're talking about winter wheat or whichever species is after they break dormancy. So there's not an easy way to just looking at numbers and define that, but generally when plants start to green up, so you start seeing those plants going from that yellow, they really look really bad sometimes in the winter, and they start greening up a little bit. Right at that beginning of green up, you can go and do the assessment. General rule of thumb for winter wheat is if you look at the temperature, the daily average temperature for the last 14 days. So basically, if you look at the average temperature for the last 14 days and then average those out, that 2-week period, whenever that's above 40 degrees Fahrenheit, that means your wheat is back to actively growing. It resumed growth in the spring, and that's right after that is a good time to go out, and you should be seeing those plants greening up a little bit, and then you can do an accurate stand count. You definitely don't want to do that before plants start resuming growth, because it's really hard to tell which plants are dead or which plants are just dormant, right? Like those plants are going to look yellow, and usually you're going to underestimate your stand count if you go too early. That's usually the problem. And that breaking the dormancy also depends a little bit on species and even varieties. Another kind of rule of thumb is so wheat, if you look at cold tolerance, wheat is about this comparably as cold tolerant as triticale. Cereal rye is the most cold tolerant of the typical species that we plant here in Pennsylvania. And then barley would be the least cold tolerant of those that I mentioned. But general rule of thumb that 40 degrees Fahrenheit kind of apply across all of those. Like I said, maybe you want to wait a little bit more for barley. You can go a little bit earlier for cereal rye.
So I will say I've looked on the internet and there is not really a good temperature average calculator. And so to do that, right, to get to this 40, 40 degree over 2 week period, it does take a little bit of work, right? You have to put in some effort. You have to do that. You have to kind of want it to work out for you, right? It's not this simple thing that we can go in here and we can plug in March 5th to March 15th or something and just generate this number. So I think that what she mentioned about green versus yellow and looking at some of that also really kind of pertains a lot to this too. Dr. G, how does that pertain to our forages, whether this be, and when I say forages, I'm speaking mostly to our perennial things like alfalfa and orchard grass and those types of forages.
Yes, for different forage species, the base temperature to break the dormancy will be totally different. For example, for alfalfa, the optimum growth temperature is 60 to 75 degrees, but the minimum to grow actively is 41 degrees F, okay? So for orchard grass can be as low as 32 degrees, just around the freezing temperature. So different species will break their dormancy totally different, can be several weeks difference in the early spring. Rule of thumb, whenever you want to evaluate the perennial cool season grasses like tall fescue, orchard grass, meadow broom, smooth broom, timothy, perennial ryegrass, if we have the air temperature above 32 for several days together, it's a time to look at the field. If it's green, it's the time to do the stat assessment. So for forage stat assessment is a kind of half science, half art. Just go to the field. If it's green, if it's above 32 for several days, do it. For alfalfa, we can wait a little bit later. That is 40 degrees rather than 32. So maybe 2 weeks later than those perennial cool season grasses is a kind of rule of thumb for this kind of assessment time. But remember one thing, if we have a very volatile weather in the spring, you have several weeks very warm, suddenly you have a cold spell, you may want to do this stat assessment again in case we have some kind of late season winter kill. Thank you.
Dr. G, I think you were reading my mind because I was just thinking about that is 2 weeks ago we were negative 15 degrees over here, right? And everything was just brown and rock bottom. And then 3-4 days later, we were like mid 50s to 60s. And it was amazing how fast everything woke back up. And then now we're back single digits. And like all of a sudden, we're back brown again, right? So there are these like ebbs and flows in awake and asleep and awake and asleep, right? Or is it just kind of a perception that we see as we drive down the road?
Yeah, so related to forage especially, it can be very tough because it's perennial and because of our misconception. Also, I think it is tough, but anything tough doesn't mean it will be there forever. That means if we have a volatile weathers, it could be winter killed, especially in the early spring period.
Yeah, and just a note on the not perennials, when you're thinking about small grains, that's a very good point, Justin, because if we're having that volatile weather, you want to do another stand count, and that would be really your final stand count. I guess the last time that you do that, and that you don't have those crazy cold temperatures again following that. And with annual crops, if they resume growth and they start actively growing again, and then you get this cold spells and you get some winter kill. I mean, that's it. They're not gonna come back from winter kill, and so you're not gonna have your stand assessment increase. You might see it decrease once you do that more than once. So yeah, very good point.
Sure, and I guess that's the important part of this kind of timeline for those small grains, that you have those 40 degrees over 2 weeks, right? We're looking at the continual break of that dormancy, and we're past the point where we're gonna see these swings that reduce it. And maybe weird things happen in the spring sometimes, right? There might be a case where we have consistent 2 weeks, and then all of a sudden we get a cold snap, and then we probably have to think about doing another stand count, I'm assuming. So maybe we'll start there. Maybe we'll start, Daniela, with the small grains assessment. So presumably, what we've kind of talked about so far, when we're doing these stand coats, the real goal here is to assess how many plants are alive, how many plants are healthy, and then decide. And we probably need to make some hard decisions based on that number, right? It's not just so we can feel good or bad about our crop, right? There may be some decisions of, based on this number, do I go forward with growing this crop this season or not, right? I think sometimes people overlook that decision can be made sooner rather than later, and you might be able to do something else with that field. So maybe we can start with small grains here. Can you tell us a little bit about how we can use that stand count to maybe make those hard decisions?
Sure. So I'm just gonna quote numbers here from our agronomy guide. All right, and also I think looking at our wheat tour numbers from the past few years, because I think we're seeing some trends here. But overall, you want, if when you do those stand counts, you want to have at least 20 plants per foot square. So if you know your row space, you can do that calculation to see how many plants you need to count on per row per linear foot. But usually that at least 20 plants per foot square, that'll set you up for reasonable yields. And this is really based on back calculating from the number of heads that we need to set us up for good yields. So I'm assuming here 20 plants per foot square times 2.5 tillers per plant. We usually see each plant tillering having anywhere between 2 and 3 tillers for good tillering. Productive tillers, right? So 20 plants times 2.5 head productive tillers per plant, that will give you 50 heads per foot square. And that actually brings you up to about 2.5 million per acre, 2.5 million heads per acre. So thinking about that, those seeding rates numbers, you're having that 2.5 tillers per plant. So usually that will set you up for good yields. We've seen those numbers in the past few years in the wheat tour, and we're seeing like reasonable yields with those numbers. And like I said, I'm assuming your plants are still going to tiller right in the spring. If you have less than 12 plants per foot square, now that's using a back calculation of 30 heads per square foot. So meaning even if those plants tiller and get 2.5 tillers per plant, at the end of the season, you're going to get 30 heads per square foot. That usually is going to set you up for pretty low yields. Now that's a hard decision you need to make, like how low of a yield can you afford? But that's usually what we've been seeing. If you have that less than 12 plants per square foot, end up with less than 30 heads per square foot. Generally, that's the case where people are thinking about terminating and going to another crop in the summer.
And I think you brought up a good point, right? That these numbers, so you kind of threw at us the 20 plants per square foot with 2.5 tillers gets you like 50 heads, and that would be kind of I don't know if optimum's the right word, but that's the beginning of your optimum, right? Of where you want to be for good yields, and good yields is something that will depend on where you are, what the field you're looking at, what your goals are, right? So less than 12 is kind of your baseline for low yields, right? So I think that it's important that we know these numbers, but also is it true that this isn't a standard rule, right? It's going to kind of depend on your own operation, your own soils, what you can expect from your field. Would you say that's a fair assumption that, and it also probably depends on what's the alternative, right? If you have, if you don't have an alternative and you have less than 12, would it still make sense to keep that wheat field, right?
Yes, for sure. So yeah, those numbers are based on yields that we're used in Pennsylvania. Um, as you, if you're in a very productive soil, if your yield potential is greater, you're usually going to get more than that 50 heads per foot. And I think you said it it right. Like that's 50 heads per foot is really the beginning of your optimum. So if you have really high yields, like I'm talking 100, let's say 150 bushels per acre here in Pennsylvania, we're usually seeing more heads than that, like 70, 80 heads per square foot. So that really depends on your yield potential. I think those numbers are reasonable based on the yields that we have here in Pennsylvania. Also, I mentioned there's a trend that we've been seeing, and those I've been looking at numbers from our past wheat tours a few years. And I was even talking with some wheat breeders the other day about this. I think so. We're seeing generally still good yields with a lower number of heads per area in the past, I don't know, in the past few years, I would say at least. We used to need more higher number of heads to get us to good yields, and I think there's something going on there with breeding. Newer varieties are having like bigger heads, and so we're able to attain the same amount of yield, the same level of yield with less heads per square foot. I think there's some of that going on too. But yeah, generally, if you're and you can see if you look at recommendations from southern states or states with higher yields than we have here in Pennsylvania, you're usually going to see those optimum number of heads per acre or per foot square higher than the 50 heads per foot square that I'm talking about. So you can definitely have more than that. But yeah, usually like with that at least 50 heads, we're still seeing good yields here in Pennsylvania.
So if we're looking at something that is down in this 12-14 range, right? I mean, looking at these agronomy guide numbers, and just for context, the estimate is that if you're in a stand of 12 to 14 plants per square foot, your yield potential is something like 60 to 70%, right? And so that's why we would be making this determination to terminate. What are your options then? How do we kind of calculate through what we do there? Is it just as simple as terminating and going to something else?
Yeah, and I think about, if you're comparing, I guess, with a poor percent of soybean and corn, I think you still have some good options there following wheat, because we're making this decision still early enough before the summer. So yeah, I think if you decide to terminate, then you have, all the options of summer crops that we have here. I think most people will go into corn or soybeans. We usually want to go alternate cereal crops with legume crops, so soybeans would probably be a good choice there. We tend to avoid corn after wheat, or vice versa, just following cereal crop after cereal crop, mainly because of diseases. The main one we're concerned here in PA is Fusarium head blight. One thing I'll say, and maybe I'm going out of my expertise here, but I was just thinking about this before. Maybe Ryan can help me out. Thinking about Fusarium head blight and infection timing, usually we don't want that corn, for example, to follow up wheat, because that Fusarium head blight pathogen, the reproductive structure of that fungus survives in the crop residue over the winter, and then it's going to affect the corn in the next year. Now, in that scenario where you're terminating your wheat that early, we know that wheat gets infected typically it gets infected at the heading stage. So typically that reproductive structure is gonna enter the plant through the heads, through the spikelet. That's also the best environmental conditions, right? The temperature is warm, and that's usually when the wheat gets infected. So in that case, like if you have a lot of infection, then planting corn after that doesn't sound like a good idea. But if we're terminating wheat early, I know wheat plants can still get infected through other routes, like the spores can enter the wheat plants through the leaf or through the stem, but that's less of a common route as far as I know. And also the condition, the weather in the fall and in the winter are less conducive, right, to that infection to happen. So that just makes me think that generally your chances of carryover of that disease are going to be much lower in that case when you're terminating the wheat now, like in the spring, right before heading.
Yeah,
So it
I
makes
think
me
you're
less
right
concerned
there.
about this rotation. Would you say this? Would you agree with that, Ryan?
Yeah, no, I think you're totally correct. I mean, the pathogens that we think of for like head scab are Fusarium species, and there's a few most common ones are Graminearum, Clamorum, and those they can, and they also infect corn. They do, but most of the transmission we do see going from the head into the next crop, they can survive in crop residue. They can cause seedling diseases, so you're not free of risk. But there's not a lot we do in agriculture that's free of risk, if that makes sense. Your likelihood is probably much, reduced, unless you have a field that really had a problem in a previous year and has had continual wheat or something like that. Again, it falls under the category that we always talk about in extension where it depends. But I think your risk is marginal enough that I would say you're pretty safe going into corn if you terminate it early enough.
Okay.
So I think one interesting point that you made there, I was quickly doing some math. I'm not necessarily advocating for this. You'd have to talk to your ag business professional on what opportunity costs and things are. But somewhere that we struggle where I'm at is what happens to that next crop? And the suggestion is we go from wheat to soybeans. Well, if our soybean yield potential is about 10 to 15% after deer damage, and we have this 12 to 14 tiller wheat that's going to give us 60 to 70% yield potential, what actually is the better crop for you at this point, right? We've got the money invested in the wheat seed. We've already worked through it. Now we've got to terminate it with another spray. We've got to buy the soybean seed. We have to cultivate and do that. And now we're getting, let's call it 10 bushels to the acre at $7.50 or $8 a bushel, right? So, I think there's a really interesting conversation that you need to be having with whoever your bookkeeper or your money manager is in this context of maybe it is something you can tolerate a little lower. But if it is that, what options do we have to improve some of these stands? If you're saying like, I think I can suffer this 70% yield loss, is there anything we can do? Is it adding fertilizer? Is it weed management? What can we do to help some of this tillering and maybe get more than 2.5 heads per plant?
Yeah, so nitrogen is one that we typically recommend. There's there's a lot you can think about that timing of the nitrogen, because that's the earlier you go, typically the more susceptible it is to be lost. But nitrogen generally triggers tillering, so it helps with tillering and just vegetative growth overall. So our recommendation is, instead of waiting until green up stage, or even some people go even a little bit later, but right at that beginning of that stem elongation stage for your spring nitrogen application, you can anticipate your nitrogen application a little bit to that very beginning of tillering. You have to get it in the right timing, so it's the conditions are not terrible, for not too high risk of loss, And usually that will be like right before, but not too late. So right at the beginning of tillering. So when you start seeing that green up, really like after you do your stand counts.
This sounds
that would
like
be the
everything
right
we do in
timing.
extension. Not at the late, not at the too early, not when it's too wet, not when it's just at the right time. If you get the
Just at the
absolute right amount, you might get this right.
But well, I guess if you're doing your stand counts, so really that right at that point, you figured out, okay, I need some more to trigger some tillering here in this field. Right there, if you know the soil is not too wet and maybe you got some rain in the forecast that will help kind of incorporate that nitrogen, that would be an ideal prime time to do that early nitrogen application. And my recommendation would be, if you're going to do this, maybe try splitting as well. That will also decrease your risk of losing that nitrogen. So put up half of what you were planning to put in at green up stage right early, right at that beginning of the green up stage and beginning of tillering, and then put the other half later, right at the end of tillering. So right at when the plants are starting to elongate, that stem is starting to elongate. So the latest you want to go, I would say, is when that first node is above the ground. Usually after that, we typically don't see much of a yield response. We see more of a grain protein response, but not so much of a yield response after that. So yeah, so anticipating your nitrogen, maybe putting half of it early on, right at the beginning of that green up stage, can help promote that tillering. You mentioned weeds. Yeah, I think, make sure your weeds are controlled. For sure, your weeds are going to compete just like tillers compete between themselves. Weeds are going to compete for moisture and nutrients in that soil. So yeah, the cleaner you have that field, the better conditions you're giving to that plants to thrive and tiller in that early spring. And that's also the time when all the weeds are coming, right? So weed control is really important. I guess those are the two things that I would say. The other, if there's other nutrient deficiencies also, that's the time when those things start showing up. Plants are starting to grow fast. So if there are any other nutritional deficiencies or any other limitations, that's also going to affect your tillering. So basically the more you can do to provide that plant with ideal conditions for growth, that'll help with tillering. When it comes to other nutritional deficiencies, it's really just, if you have a deficiency, I think some people talk about like P or K, if that's going to help with tillering. I'm not familiar with any studies that saw a response to that without there being a deficiency. Phosphorus is pretty related to tillering. Then usually you want to do that in the fall, right? So that's important. But usually we don't see, aside from nitrogen and that weed control and everything else being ideal, we don't see a response to other nutrients.
Got it. So it sounds like part of the stand assessment, right? Like we need to act pretty quickly depending on what we see. And part of the process of taking those stand counts is also observing, what are we seeing? Are we seeing some sort of purpling or yellowing of leaves that tell us there might be a nutrient deficiency? And a lot of times I get calls from folks that are doing their stand counts that are wondering, am I seeing disease, early season disease, or is it a nutrient deficiency? Like, those are important questions to ask to understand, is there a weed that's choking out my density? Do I need to do weed control, and will that resolve this issue? Is it a fertility issue? Do I need to get more tillers, right? All of those questions are great questions to ask, and I think are going to help you make that determination of what you need to do to either keep that stand and give it the best chance it has, or terminate it. And so collecting that evidence seems to be very important. So I think that's probably a good place to kind of close off our small grain assessment portion of this, and I think we could probably talk ad nauseum about any one of those pieces, but it's probably a good time to jump to G and kind of ask him in the beginning. We asked Daniela what are some of the guidelines of how we assess a spring stand is oftentimes with a count, a tiller count, and a density count. Now, can we assess maybe a leguminous's, an alfalfa, or a grass in the same way, or are there some different parameters, different rules in place?
Yeah, the short answer, yes, we do have different protocols for different forage species, but surprisingly, I want to make it universal and easy to remember. When I listened to Dr. Carrijo's response for the 50-ish seed head for winter wheat, I'm surprised because we actually shoot for that 55-ish branches or tailors for legumes, that's branches, then the tailors for grasses. So what I mean universal is it seems like no matter it is annual or perennial, it is a grain production or forage production, 50 or 55-ish number is the magic number. So let me explain a little bit more here. If we count alfalfa, we will count the major branches above the soil surface, above the soil alfalfa crown. So if you have a very decent, good size branch, we will count as one. Okay, so that's the alfalfa. For tillers, we have to dig a little bit deeper and be careful, count each individual plat, daughter plats, this time from the mother crown area, and count each one as one. So if we get to 55 number, it is good. Above that, better. The denser, the better. I don't think there will be a number like too dense to limit the yield because the plants have the self-thinning mechanisms. To a point, it will be self-thinned. So that is one criteria, a similar number as Dr. Carrijo's number there. Also, I think if we look at the forage, the big difference between grain and forage, it's very difficult to identify the plant individual numbers, like what is the true plant population, the true plant density. But I threw some numbers out, so just in case someone can identify that individual alfalfa plant carefully, easily. For the first year alfalfa after seeding, we require about 25 to 30 individual alfalfa plants per square feet. Okay, for the second year, it is 10 to 15. For the third year, it's 5 to 6. So it's every year we lose about 10 to 15 plants aggressively. Okay, by doing the branching tailoring, actually can compensate for that individual loss. Okay, so I will stop here. The number is very similar, 50, 50-ish, 55. And individual populations very hard to determine, but if you can determine, we do have numbers for different stand age, especially for alfalfa.
So one comment I guess I want to make there is when we're looking at forages, I think this is a great plug to say identification and the importance of identifying your grasses, right? Is if we're out there, we go out, we put out our quadrant, and we start counting tillers, and we stand up and we're like, man, I got 150 tillers out here, right? We are only counting desirable cool season grass or cool season legume species, right? This is not everything that's greening up and everything that's growing down in there is not considered part of this stand. Is that correct?
Absolutely, Justin, you hit the nails directly. So yes, we cannot count other weedy species we really don't like, especially if it's a toxic, cause any animal disorders. that is not only limited the yield, also decrease the forage quality significantly down the road. So absolutely, Justin, we want to count what we desire. Either it is alfalfa ultra grass monoculture or it is alfalfa ultra grass mixture. If you have other species, you see, well, that is still a forage resource, like Kentucky blue, but it will be low-lying, very shallow-rooted forage species maybe cannot provide that high yield and high quality when you need it.
And I think this is one of those great opportunities and why I'm so lucky to have a forage expert like Dr. G to lean on. But when you start digging around down there in late March, early April, and you're pulling thatch back and you're seeing all of these little tiny things coming up and which one's rough stalk bluegrass and which one's nimble will and which one's actually a rhizome of something important and which one is, it can be really overwhelming to look at these things. And but we stress identification all the time and the importance of knowing what are in these stands. And we can easily pull out the other ones, right? The dandelions, the multifloras, the Canada thistles, quickly throw out the trash. But take some time, think of what you've got. Cell phones are great to take pictures and go home and look at some of that stuff. And this is a great time to not only scout densities, but also some weed assessment.
Absolutely.
So if you're out there and you've done this and you get all of this taken care of and you make this assessment and you're like, not the 55, not the 50, say you're at 40 mark. What are your options to do? Now, I think that these are going to be a little different, whether this is an alfalfa stand versus whether it's more of a grass type stand. But what do we really kind of consider here to do to build these stands back up?
Yeah, so I want to take one step back. If you have a stand, the stem count or the tailor count lower than 40, you will ask yourself, what is the causing factor to get this sparse stand? Maybe it is the bad management from the preceding years, or maybe it's a bad soil fertility baseline from the preceding management years. So here, perennial forages is very, very sensitive to the harvesting stubble height, harvesting stubble, harvesting frequency, especially the very last harvest in the fall. Okay, so we have all kinds of resources, and I think Justin can dig out all those useful information for you. I will not elaborate here too much, but I want to mention soil fertility here briefly. Phosphorus and potassium are very, very important for winter hardiness of these perennial forages. Okay, potassium is a cation and causes that osmotic pressure potential like alcohol in your freezer. You never get a freeze those kind of alcohol. That's a similar analogy. So potassium will help these legumes and grasses go over winter much better. The phosphorus actually, on the other hand, constrains the plant's root system and help for winter hardiness. So then, let's answer Justin's question directly. For this year,
Anytime someone takes time to speak about potassium benefit in forage, I am always willing to forego my question to hear it. That is something we don't specify and talk about enough. So I appreciate you taking the time to do that, Dr. G.
Oh, thank you. So looking at the field with less than 40 branches or tailors, it is a kind of hard situation. First, I try to help the stand as much as I can. So my first option is to make it better rather than let's give up and move on. Okay, so how to make it better? Let's do a very simple math. Forage yield is a combination or a product of branch or tailor numbers multiply the tailor or branch size. So if we can maximize the tailor or branch size, we can still achieve the similar yield, even we have very limited branches or tiller numbers. So how do we do that? For legumes, I mentioned before, phosphorus, potassium. For grasses, mainly nitrogen. So the nitrogen will increase the tiller size first, then it will even foster the tillering process, make more tillers. Also, I think it will be very beneficial for the crude protein level for the forage quality. So soil fertility management is the #1 option to improve the stead. The second one is harvest timing. So we want to maybe delay the first harvest time for this assessment year. The reason for that is give the stead a break. So the legumes and grasses will recover and make those kind of beautiful branches and tillers aggressively, and maybe can be even better than last year, going to the second or third cut. Okay, so the individual forage plots will not increase. If you have 10 plots per square feet, it will not be 12 for sure. Okay, but the tillers or branches per individual of those forage species can multiply tremendously from 5 to 10 to 15, even to 25. Okay, so that is the fertility and harvest management to make the stead better. Well, no matter how hard we try, we will get to a point. It is lower than 40, far away from 40. It is impossible to improve the stead to a high yield potential. So that's the time you can consider other management practices. So Justin, what is your favorite management practices to this point? You threw a name out. Let's see if we can we share something similar.
Yes, so I think by working for extension, my favorite management has to be mowing height, right? I think that we're forced to take that vow when we sign up here to work in the forage industry of extension, that every talk I give, I have to say, what is your mowing height at least 3 times or I lose my job. No, I'm just kidding. No, I think that is one of the biggest things that we don't recognize as much, is what detriment we're doing and how we can affect with our forages, with our mowing height. I agree a lot with what you said on our timing. And I think specifically this year, there were a lot of decisions, maybe good or bad, around the timing when we were in this kind of droughty situation or this heat stress situation on cool season grasses, and what we decided to do in July or August, whether we cut or whether we didn't, and the impact that that will now lead to this spring in some of our stand assessments.
Well, thank you, Justin. So I want to add 2 more points here to renovate the very thin sparse steads, either alfalfa or grasses. For alfalfa, it is absolutely not good to seed alfalfa into the alfalfa in a hope to make the alfalfa stead denser. So that is a no-brainer. It cannot do stuff. So it's caused by the alfalfa autotoxicity, those chemicals released from the root system, from the above ground leaves of alfalfa, prohibited those kind of alfalfa seed to germinate and to establish. But you can do something different. You can maybe throw a grass into those kind of alfalfa sparse stead, or vice versa. We can add a legume to the sparse grass stead, or you can even add a different grass species or different grass cultivar into the sparse stead. Just a good timing with this seed technology and soil moisture availability stuff. That is another podcast. So besides interseeding, I think a termination for the very sparse forages stead is something I'm okay with. Even though I love those forages, but to a point, we have to terminate. And those kind of perennial forages for past 3 to 5 years accumulate a lot of soil organic matter, fix a lot of nitrogen, and make this soil very healthy for a crop rotation scenario, either corn, soybean, winter wheat. So these perennial forages will give the benefits to other cropping systems and situations. So by seeing that, that means we should have a plan, a rotation plan in place. So you rotate those kind of sparse forage stead, then you rotate back for some good forage stead to start right after corn, soybean, or winter wheat. So that is a good harmony between annual cropping systems and the perennial forage production fields. So I will stop there.
So
Let you ask questions.
yeah, gee, I have one question here when it comes to termination. So it sounds like when we're talking about forages, right? This decision is much more complex, right? Because of our ability to interseed very easily. And it sounds like it's more based on what your goals are, right? Like, are there cases? So let's take alfalfa out of this and say it's a grass field that has, you don't have a lot of plants per square foot, right? Your decision there is, do I put interseed, right? Because I can do that with a grass, or do I decide to terminate? Is this a case where maybe the termination step would just have to do with what your operation looks like? Do you need a good fertile field to put an annual in? Or maybe I have a lot of weed pressure and that's a good way to manage it. Could you give us maybe a case where you'd say yes, definitely terminate it and don't interseed? Does that exist?
Very cool question, but I have no cool answer. So here, for a very sparse forage stand, termination, if there's only one chance we hesitate to terminate for the very sparse stand is the forage scarcity or shortage in a specific year or season. Right now, the grain crop or grain price is not as hot as a forage price. So if we are short for forages, because of transportation cost, we cannot haul forage from Ohio to Pennsylvania easily. So what that mean? Yes, the yield for the sparse stead could be half of the potential. Let's say 3 tons per acre rather than 5 tons per acre. But you still have that 3 tons per acre for sure this year without sacrificing for the establishment year yield levels. But if we have a good plan in place, you do have a plan like, okay, this year I foresee my stead is thinner and thinner, and I already have a good stead somewhere in my farm on my farm, and that shortage of the forage could be lessened and not the limiting factor to make a right decision. Okay, I will stop there.
So one thing I'll add to this, and since I've got specialists, I can say this, and then if I'm wrong, we just edit it out and it's like it never happened, right? I think a big important part of this, before we terminate stands, whether they be small grains or whether they be forages, and G kind of alluded to this, is we need to check our fertility status as to partially what's going on here, right? And I was always kind of brought up in this. If you've got a thinning forage stand, first thing we do is take a fertility status, and if it's poor, let's see if we fertilize it if it gets better, right? The worst thing that happens is we put some fertilizer down and then we terminate with this clean canvas to reseed into. If we're talking about interseeding or starting forages, or if we're talking about our small grains and we pull this sample and our potassium is 60 and our phosphorus is 9, there is no surprise that we have a thinning stand here, right? And terminating or interseeding or adding something new to this, we are going to be very disappointed with what grows back after we've taken this next step. And we kind of always think, or we assume, like, oh no, if they're doing this, they've checked that box already before they came to us wondering what was going on. But that is a very important box that has to be looked at or checked before we start thinking about any of these other steps. Is don't forget about the phosphorus and the potassium and small grains, the lime, right? What if your pH is out of balance if you're talking your barleys, right? So there's a lot of these other things that we have to consider before we just let's terminate it and let's add something to it.
Yeah, and I think that's part of your stand assessment too. I mean, we're talking about counting plants, the plants that have overwintered and are alive at this point. But in addition to count the plants that are alive, we also want to see how healthy they are, right? So I think that at that point, those stand counts also include just getting a good grasp of the overall health of that field. And that includes looking for nutritional deficiencies. If you see something, you can get a tissue test at that point easily for any of the nutrients. Also look for diseases and weeds. We talked about the weeds and diseases a little bit here. We talked about the fusarium head blight, but there's also other things that can also be confounded with nutritional deficiencies. Like one example is, I just thought of barley yellow dwarf virus that's somewhat common for us here, which is usually, those stunted yellow looking. Sometimes they get some purpling on the leaves in patches, and you might get that confused with nitrogen or another nutrient deficiency there. But it's important for us to know what is what, so you can decide, okay, like, is a nitrogen application gonna solve this problem, or is it something else? Like in the case of barley dwarf virus, there's really nothing you can do at this point. All the management practices that you can do for that are in the fall, really. But at least knowing what's out there is important, so you can eliminate some options, right? So, and putting nitrogen is not going to help. Also thinking about the next rotation, if you're going to, whatever you're going to plant next, think about that virus and other crops that can affect that. So yeah, just looking for that general assessment of health in addition to counting plants is important at that point. And there's things you can do at that point, there's things you cannot do at this point, but at least knowing what's the situation is very important.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, and I guess that's good homework for our viewers. We have looking in, at least in my area, we have about a month till we can, and depending on how this winter goes, maybe a little bit more than a month till we really have to start doing our seeing green up and doing our stand assessments. So in that time period, why don't you study up some diseases, look at some of the problems, the health issues that could occur, and be ready to we do have a diagnostic clinic if you're in Pennsylvania that you can send samples to. So have your bags ready, have that paperwork ready to go and send. If you see something that's a problem, you can get an answer pretty quickly. So I think that's a great place to kind of wrap things up here. And I think I learned a lot here today as we move into this spring season and the exciting emergence of these small grains and forages. I feel a little bit more prepared to go and work with my farmers and help them make these decisions myself. And so I hope for our viewers that they feel a little bit more prepared as well. So Justin, do you have anything else to ask or say?
I've been like frantically taking notes. I'm looking forward to some 2 weeks of 40-degree plus weather so that I can get out there. I'll practice my counting to getting to 50 and 55. And I think I'm ready to get after it.
That's right. Now it's in the hands of the groundhog, right? Or groundhog Phil. So hopefully that comes sooner rather than later, or it depends what you want. Do you want more winter, or do you kind of want to get in the field, right? That's your own decision, right? So another place where it depends. So Daniela, Dr. G, thank you very much for coming on today. I think this was a very practical episode, and I sure learned a lot. So I hope our listeners feel the same way. And yeah, thank you guys for coming.
Thank you.
My Lord, thank you.
Yeah.
I learned a lot too. Thanks.
Awesome. Well, great. Well, for our listeners, again, this is kind of one part of a 2-episode series, if you will. So that other episode is going to be with Zach Curtis, and we're going to talk a little bit more about the specifics of how to really do a solid stand count and assess tillering and we'll talk a little bit about a bag test and how to do that. So look forward to that, and we'll catch you on that next episode of the Agronomy Highlights podcast.